You have heard the phrase 100 times. War crime. It shows up in news reports, in courtroom dramas, in history documentaries, always spoken with the same grave certainty, as if it has meant the same thing since the beginning of human conflict. You picture ancient tribunals, timeless laws, a rule that has always existed to separate the horror of war from the horror that goes too far even for war. But that rule is barely older than the light bulb. And once you understand where it actually came from, who wrote it, who broke it, and who got away with it, you will never hear those two words the same way again. Here's what almost nobody realizes going in. The entire legal idea of a war crime is a relatively recent invention, built by a small handful of specific people, tested in real time against the worst atrocities of the 20th century, and riddled from the very beginning with the exact kind of hypocrisy it was supposed to eliminate. The men who wrote the rules broke them. The nations who prosecuted the guilty protected some of the guiltiest. And the very word used to describe the worst crime imaginable was created by one grieving man, working inside the trial that would define the term forever. To understand any of that, you have to go back to where the concept even began. The phrase war crime did not exist in any formal legal sense until 1872. A German jurist named Johann Caspar Bluntschli was the first person to use the term, and his original definition was much narrower than what you'd expect. To Bluntschli, a war crime simply meant a soldier acting without orders during a conflict. It had nothing to do with atrocities against civilians, nothing to do with torture or mass killing. The English version of the term did not even appear until 1906, buried inside a legal textbook called International Law, written by a jurist named Lasse Oppenheim. Sit with that for a second. Humanity has been fighting organized wars for thousands of years, and the legal concept used to hold people accountable for the worst of it is less than 200 years old. But the idea that war needed rules at all traces back even further, to one man carrying a wound that never fully closed. In 1862, in the middle of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln commissioned a German-American legal scholar named Francis Lieber to draft a formal code of conduct for soldiers. What Lieber produced became known as General Orders No. 100, and it is considered the founding document of the modern laws of war. Everything that came after it, every Geneva Convention, every modern rule of engagement, traces its lineage back to Lieber's code. What almost nobody knows is why Lieber approached the task the way he did. His own sons were fighting on opposite sides of the war he was trying to write rules for. Two of his sons fought for the Confederacy. One of them was killed in battle. Lieber wasn't writing an abstract legal document. He was a father who had already lost a child to the very violence he was trying to contain. That's the origin. Now here's what they have in common. Every single case you're about to hear, from Nuremberg to Vietnam, to a secret laboratory in occupied China. Each one exposes the same uncomfortable truth. The system built to punish war crimes has never been applied evenly. The winners get to decide who stands trial. And sometimes, the people who should be standing trial are the ones writing the rules, running the tribunals, or working quietly on the payroll of the very government prosecuting everyone else. Nowhere is that clearer than in the trial that made the term famous. In 1946, the world watched the Nuremberg trials, 24 of the most senior surviving figures of the Third Reich, tried by an international tribunal for crimes against humanity. That's the version of Nuremberg you already know. What almost nobody knows is that 12 more trials happened at Nuremberg afterward, and they weren't run by an international court at all. They were conducted entirely by the American military. These trials went after names history barely remembers. The doctor's trial prosecuted 23 leading physicians who had participated directly in the Nazi euthanasia program, experimenting on and killing patients deemed unfit to live. The Einsatzgruppen trial went after 24 commanders of the mobile SS killing squads responsible for mass shootings across Eastern Europe. The Russia trial prosecuted the systematic kidnapping of children deemed racially Aryan and the coordinated extermination of Jewish populations. 12 trials. Dozens of men responsible for some of the most calculated atrocities of the war, and almost no one outside a historian's office has ever heard their names. Even the famous trial wasn't as clean as it looks in the textbooks. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time, a man named Harlan Fiske Stone, watched the Nuremberg proceedings unfold and did not see justice. He called it, in his own words, a high-grade lynching party, and said the whole affair was a little too sanctimonious a fraud to meet his standards. His objection wasn't abstract. Soviet generals sat on the judging panel at Nuremberg, prosecuting Nazi leaders for the invasion of Poland in 1939. Those same Soviet generals had conspired with Germany to invade and divide Poland in that exact same year. The people judging the crime had committed a version of the same crime and simply never faced the consequences. And that leads to something that happened just before Nuremberg began, something that shaped how seriously the entire concept of a war crime was going to be taken by the very government hosting the trials. In 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, executed 22,000 Polish military officers in a forest called Katyn. It is one of the most documented mass atrocities of the 20th century. But here is the part that rarely makes it into any summary. A United States congressional committee investigated the Katyn massacre years later, in 1952, and concluded that Franklin Roosevelt's own administration had actively suppressed public knowledge of the killings during the war, citing what officials called military necessity. The committee recommended the Soviets be formally charged at an international tribunal. That recommendation was never acted on. To this day, Russia does not officially classify Katyn as a war crime or an act of genocide, because doing so would legally obligate the prosecution of anyone still alive connected to it. So the pattern is set early. Justice, when it comes to war crimes, has always been selective, shaped by political convenience rather than the severity of the act itself. And nowhere does that pattern repeat more disturbingly than in what happened decades later, on the other side of the world, buried for over 3 decades before anyone outside the military knew it existed. In 1967, an elite 45-man unit of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division, known as Tiger Force, carried out what a later Army investigation would determine to be the longest series of atrocities documented during the entire Vietnam War, spanning roughly 7 months. In 1971, the Army opened a formal investigation into what happened. That investigation ran for 4.5 years. At the end of it, investigators concluded that 18 individual soldiers had committed war crimes ranging from murder to mutilation of the dead. And then, nothing happened. No charges were ever filed against a single member of Tiger Force. Several of the men involved went on to become some of the most decorated soldiers of the entire war. The unit itself received a Presidential Unit Citation. The story stayed buried until 2003, when a newspaper called the Toledo Blade finally broke it to the public, an investigation that won a Pulitzer Prize decades after the crimes themselves had already faded from memory. Compare that to what happened after World War II, on the other side of the globe, involving crimes so extreme that even reading a plain description of them is difficult. Between 1933 and 1945, inside a facility run by the Japanese Kwantung Army, a program known as Unit 731 conducted biological warfare experiments on human beings. The internal code name for the victims was Maruta, a Japanese word that translates to logs. An estimated 300,000 people, including pregnant women, the elderly, and prisoners of war from China, Korea, Mongolia, Russia, and allied nations, were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, deliberate infection with pathogens like anthrax and plague, and extreme environmental torture, all performed as controlled experiments. For decades, the Japanese government simply denied the program existed. Formal public acknowledgement of Unit 731's activities didn't fully surface until the 1980s and 2000s. Here is the part that turns this from a story of buried atrocity into a story of buried atrocity that was actively protected by the country that claimed to stand for justice. General Shiro Ishii, the man who ran Unit 731, never stood trial. In a deal personally arranged by General Douglas MacArthur, Ishii handed over more than 10,000 pages of what the program called research findings in exchange for full immunity from war crimes prosecution. He wasn't just spared. He was later invited to lecture at Fort Detrick, the United States Army's own biological weapons research facility in Maryland. The man behind 300,000 deaths traded his data for a podium. That trade wasn't an isolated exception. It was closer to a pattern, one that reached into the heart of America's most celebrated post-war achievements. After the war, a secret American initiative called Operation Paperclip recruited more than 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and doctors, some of them deeply implicated in war crimes, and brought them to the United States. Their records were altered. Their Nazi affiliations were erased. Many of them were granted full American citizenship and government salaries, going on to work at the highest levels of American research. Arthur Rudolph, the project director behind the Saturn V rocket, the machine that carried astronauts to the moon, renounced his American citizenship in 1984, specifically to avoid facing prosecution for war crimes once his past finally caught up with him. The full scope of Operation Paperclip wasn't made public until Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act in 1998, more than 50 years after the program began. And through all of it, one word threads back to a single man, standing inside the very trial that exposed so much of this hypocrisy, while somehow also cementing humanity's first real legal defense against it. In 1944, a Polish-born lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, working as an advisor to the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, coined a word that did not exist before him. He combined the Greek word genos, meaning tribe or race, with the Latin suffix side, meaning killing. The word was genocide. Lemkin defined it as a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at destroying the essential foundations of a national group's existence. He wasn't writing from theory. Lemkin lost nearly 50 relatives in the Holocaust. The word he invented to describe the destruction of a people came from a man who had personally lived through the destruction of his own. The Nuremberg trials became the first prosecutions for genocide in the history of the world, using a word coined during the trial itself by a man carrying that exact grief into the courtroom every single day. So here is what you're left with, once every piece is on the table. A legal term less than 200 years old. A founding document written by a grieving father with sons on both sides of a war. A famous trial the country's own Chief Justice called a fraud. 12 forgotten trials that punished names history erased. A massacre covered up by the very government that later claimed to champion justice. An elite unit whose crimes were investigated for 4.5 years and then quietly buried. A biological warfare commander who traded human experimentation data for immunity and a lecture invitation. 1,600 Nazi professionals rebranded as American assets. And one word, genocide, born from personal loss, used for the very first time to prosecute a horror the world had never had language for. You started this video thinking a war crime was a fixed, timeless idea, something ancient and absolute. It isn't. It's a young, fragile, deeply human invention, built by grieving fathers and traumatized lawyers, applied unevenly by the very powers who wrote it, and broken quietly, again and again, by the people who were supposed to enforce it the most. The next time you hear those two words on the news, you won't just hear an accusation. You'll hear the entire tangled, hypocritical, unfinished history behind them.